The recommendations covered a number of different areas. One was around culture. So it's quite clear that given all of these behavioural issues, we need to have cultures that are actually supportive of what people are doing. Now, what we did tend to find was that in the large accountancy firms, there were quite developed ethical protocols and procedures, but those were not as developed in the smaller firms. So smaller firms wouldn't be expected to have a whole raft of procedures and policies, but they can still have ethical values. People can still know who they should speak to if they've got an ethical dilemma and those sorts of things. The other issue around culture, I think, for the accountancy profession is that in the large firms, people were actually raising as an ethical issue the long working hours and the kind of working practices, especially around busy season. Now, people might not always think of those as ethical, but it's quite clear that the people who were speaking to us did regard that as ethical. And what they were saying was, if you have somebody who's sleeping for 3 hours a night for weeks on end in busy season, that's not good for them as an individual, and it's not actually good for the quality of audit either. So there are a number of recommendations, I think, for accounting firms and for organisational culture. More broadly, what people often felt was that the first move into industry or commerce could be a bit of a culture shock, and sometimes they went to places where they had wonderful experiences, sometimes the experiences were really very difficult indeed. And what people said there was that they wanted to have zero tolerance of bullying type behaviours, in the sense that if somebody was doing something that they weren't happy with, they wanted to be able to feel that they could raise that issue and that their concerns would be dealt with seriously. So that's the first broad set of recommendations. The second set are around education. Things like trying to develop in people an awareness of how to have a difficult conversation, how to be resilient, the kind of strategies that people might put in place in order to try to manage those sorts of situations. And of course, because I was speaking to people at all stages in their career, right from newly qualified through to the most senior levels, I think it's really important that we don't just think of education as initial education in the 3-year training contract, but actually we need to keep reinforcing that through CPD as well. I think listening is another area of recommendation. There's quite a lot of focus on speaking up at the moment, but speaking is a two-way communicative process, and there's no point speaking up if nobody listens. So we need to have more emphasis on equipping people to listen meaningfully and effectively, so that people feel that their concerns were worth raising in the first place. And there were a couple of final recommendations that people made, which are perhaps specific to professional bodies. One is a professional body is a network, and people sometimes said that with hindsight, they should have done more to maintain their network throughout their career, because when they did have an ethical dilemma, they didn't have somebody to talk to. So I think there's a message there that we need to keep reinforcing, the fact that CAs, or indeed other professionals, are people that you can talk to in a trusted manner, and if you have a dilemma, there's somebody who's probably gone through something similar in the past that can perhaps offer some advice, or even if it's not advice, just a listening ear. And the final thing is, I think, actually related to that as well. It's to do with mentoring. A number of people said that they would actually quite like to have a mentor, somebody who was not going to solve their problems for them. They recognised that only the person themselves can really solve their own problem and deal with their situation, but somebody who could perhaps be a critical friend who would be able to give them a little bit of advice, or just to even ask the right questions to get them thinking about different things. So I think those were some of the main recommendations that we've put forward.